Sonara had been told many things about the Alpha King in the weeks before this moment. That he was ruthless, that he had ended the Grey March Rebellion with a violence so absolute it still made hardened warriors look away. That his wolf was the largest anyone had seen in 3 generations, and that his eyes held the cold patience of a predator who never needed to rush. No one had warned her that his voice would sound tired. She stood at the foot of the dais in a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, her dark hair braided in the traditional style of her pack, and tried to remember how to breathe. The Ashenmere delegation had sent her with 3 days' notice, a ceremony dress that belonged to someone taller, and a letter from the pack elders wishing her well. She was 22 years old, a healer's apprentice from a border settlement of fewer than 80 wolves, and she was standing before the most powerful alpha on the continent, while 300 strangers waited to see if he would claim her. He did not look at her when he spoke. I, Thalric Velren, Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, reject the bond presented before me this day. The words fell across the great hall like the first crack of ice on a frozen lake. The assembled court sat frozen in their carved seats, their breath held, their eyes locked on the woman standing alone beneath the dais. The ceremony fires crackled in their iron brackets. The banners of the Velrin line hung motionless overhead, as though even the air had stopped. Sonara could feel every gaze in the room pressing against her skin, searching for the fracture, waiting for the moment she would break. She had imagined this scene so many times during the long ride from Ashenmere. In some versions, she wept. In others, she begged. In one particularly dramatic imagining, she fainted, which at least had the advantage of ending the humiliation quickly. In none of those versions had she smiled. But she did. Not bitterly. Not through clenched teeth. She smiled the way someone smiles when they hear the answer they were quietly hoping for. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the silent hall. "I wish you well." She dipped into a curtsy, low and unhurried, the kind matron Alara had drilled into her dozens of times before she left Ashenmere. When she rose, she met the king's eyes one last time. Something moved behind them, something she could not read and did not try to. She turned and walked back down the center aisle of the great hall. Every person in that hall watched her go. Her footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound, steady and measured, the rhythm of a woman who had somewhere to be. She passed the front row of counselors with their frozen expressions. She passed Hadric, the king's beta, who stared at her with something close to bewilderment. She passed the oak doors held open by 2 guards whose mouths hung slightly ajar. The doors closed behind her. The corridor stretched long and cold and empty. Sonara kept walking. 3 flights of stairs, 2 turns. One narrow hallway lined with windows that looked out over nothing. She reached the guest room they had given her, stepped inside, and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She folded her hands in her lap, and she breathed. The healer's text said that bond rejection felt like being split open from the inside, a fire in the blood, a howl of loss so deep it could break a wolf's mind if the bond was strong enough. Sonara waited for it the way a patient waits for a surgeon's blade, bracing, searching her chest, her gut, the quiet place beneath her ribs where her wolf usually lay curled and still. Nothing. No fire, no howl. Just a vast and familiar silence. She let out a long breath. Good. Whatever the elders had seen in her bloodwork had been wrong. There was no fated bond. The king had rejected a connection that did not truly exist, and she was free to go home. She began unpinning her hair. A knock came at the door. Sharp and urgent. She opened it to find Hadric standing in the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight. He looked like a man working very hard not to say the wrong thing. "Miss Sonara," he said, "I need you to remain within the palace grounds until further notice." Sonara frowned. I was planning to leave at first light. That won't be possible. May I ask why? Hadric hesitated. It was a small thing, barely a breath's worth of silence, but it unsettled her more than his words. There has been a complication, he said, with the king. Sonara's pulse quickened. What kind of complication? The kind I am not at liberty to discuss in a hallway. He glanced behind him. Don't leave your room tonight. Don't speak to anyone about the ceremony. I will send for you in the morning. He left before she could argue. Sonara stood in the doorway, her half-unpinned hair falling over one shoulder, and felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. She had not done anything wrong. She had been brought here by decree, not by choice. She had accepted the rejection with more composure than anyone had a right to expect. So why was the king's beta telling her to stay? That night she dreamed of a wolf. Not her own. This wolf was massive and black, with silver eyes that burned like stars held too close to the earth, and it was destroying itself, twisting against itself, convulsing, trapped in a fury so complete it looked less like pain and more like war. A war the wolf was waging against its own nature, with no intention of surviving. Sonara tried to reach for it, but the ground beneath her stretched and warped, and the distance between them grew wider the harder she ran. The wolf's howl tore through the darkness like something being ripped apart from the inside. She woke with her heart crashing against her ribs and her pillow damp with sweat. The morning light was still thin and gray when the knock came. A young guard stood in the corridor, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "You have been summoned," he said, not meeting her eyes, "by the king's council." The council chambers smelled of old wood and candle smoke and barely concealed panic. Sonara was led to a chair at the far end of a long oak table where 6 men and 1 woman sat watching her, with expressions that ranged from guarded to openly hostile. Hadric stood near the door with his arms crossed. The king was not present. "Miss Sonara of Ashenmere," said the eldest counselor, a broad-shouldered man with a white beard and eyes that catalogued everything they touched. His name was Aldrin, and he spoke the way men speak when they are used to being obeyed. "You are aware of the nature of a fated bond rejection?" "I understand the general principle," Sonara said carefully. "Then you understand that the rejected party typically suffers significant physical and emotional distress in the hours following severance." Sonara nodded. "I have read the accounts." "And are you currently experiencing any such distress?" Every person at the table was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She thought about lying. She thought about it seriously. But lying to a room full of wolves who could hear her heartbeat seemed like a poor strategy. "No," she said. "I am not." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Aldrin leaned back in his chair. The woman beside him, a sharp-featured healer whose name Sonara did not yet know, exchanged a glance with Hadric. "That is unusual," Aldrin said, in a tone that suggested unusual was the most generous word available to him. "I cannot explain it," Sonara said. "I expected pain. It never came." "It came," Hadric said quietly from the doorway. Everyone turned to look at him. The beta's face was drawn, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with sleeplessness. "It just didn't come to her." The room went very still. "What do you mean?" Sonara asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Hadric pushed off the wall and walked to the table. 12 minutes after you left the Great Hall, the king collapsed. He dropped to his knees on the dais in front of 300 witnesses and could not stand. The beta paused. His wolf turned on him. Sonara stared at him. Turned on him how? Internally. The wolf has turned against its own host. It is fighting him from the inside, and the damage is getting worse. Hadric's voice was steady, but his hands were not. The healers have never seen anything like it. The rejection was supposed to sever the bond cleanly. Instead, it seems to have inverted it. "Inverted," Sonara repeated. The pain that should have fallen on you transferred to him. His wolf is in a state of continuous revolt. Hadric held her gaze, and it is getting worse by the hour. Sonara's mind raced. The dream. The massive black wolf thrashing and howling in the dark, fighting against something she could not see. She had thought it was just a nightmare born of anxiety, but it wasn't, was it? She had been seeing what was actually happening to him. "Is he conscious?" she asked. "Barely," Hadric said. "He has been sedated, but the sedatives are losing their hold. His wolf is burning through them faster than the healers can administer." The room felt suddenly very small. Sonara pressed her palms flat against the table and tried to think clearly. "Why are you telling me this? What do you expect me to do?" Aldrin spoke before Hadric could. "We expect nothing. We are informing you of the situation because you are, whether any of us intended it, directly connected to the king's condition." "Connected," Sonara said. "He rejected me. I accepted the rejection. I felt nothing. How am I connected?" "Because his wolf is howling your name," Hadric said. The words landed like a blow. "It won't stop," the beta continued. "Through the sedation, through everything the healers have tried, the wolf keeps reaching for a bond that the king himself severed. And every time it fails to find you, it turns the pain inward." Sonara sat very still. Her hands were trembling slightly. She pressed them harder against the table until they stopped. "I want to see him," she said. Hadric shook his head. "That is not advisable. You just told me his wolf is tearing him apart and screaming my name, and your next thought is that I should not be in the same room with him? His wolf is feral right now," Hadric said. "Unpredictable. If it senses you nearby, we don't know what it will do." "And if I leave?" Sonara asked. "If I walk out of this palace and ride back to Ashenmere, what happens to him then?" The silence answered for them. Aldrin cleared his throat. "We are exploring every option." "You don't have options," Sonara said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her. "You have me." She stood up. "Take me to him." Hadric looked at Aldrin. Aldrin looked at the healer. The healer looked at Sonara with a measuring, careful gaze, then nodded once. They led her through corridors she had never walked before, deeper into the palace, past guards who stepped aside with wide eyes. The air grew warmer, thicker, heavy with the unmistakable scent of alpha distress. It was sharp and metallic, like iron and lightning, and it coated the back of Sonara's throat with every breath. The king's chambers were at the end of a long hallway lined with closed doors. Two healers stood outside, their expressions grim. One of them had fresh scratches across his forearm. He threw a table at Brennick. The other healer murmured to Hadric, "The sedation isn't holding." Hadric opened the door. The room was in ruins. Furniture overturned. A wooden chair splintered against the far wall. Deep scratches scored into the stone floor in ragged lines, as though something had been dragged or had dragged itself. And in the center of the wreckage, on his knees, was the Alpha King. Thalric Velrin looked nothing like the man who had stood on the dais and spoken her rejection in a voice of iron. His shirt was torn. His hands were raw where claws had half emerged and retracted over and over, leaving angry welts across his knuckles. His head was bowed, his breathing ragged and labored, and a low, continuous growl rolled through his chest like distant thunder. Sonara stepped inside. Every instinct she possessed told her to run. Every rational thought screamed that she was walking toward a predator who was no longer fully in control of his own body. But she kept walking because the growl was not a threat. She could hear it now, the pitch of it, the raw desperation underneath the sound. It was not rage. It was grief. She knelt in front of him. His head snapped up. Silver eyes, not gray. His wolf was at the surface, pressing forward, and the pupils were blown wide with pain. "I am here," Sonara said quietly. The growl stopped. For one suspended moment, the entire room held its breath. Then Thalric's wolf surged forward and his hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard, not violent. His fingers wrapped around her wrist the way a drowning man grips a rope, and the tension in his body dissolved like a knot being cut. His breathing steadied. The claws retracted. The silver bled back into gray, and the king blinked at her with eyes that were human again, confused, exhausted, and utterly humiliated. He released her wrist like it burned him. "Get her out," he rasped, not looking at her. Hadric stepped forward. "Sire, your wolf." "I said get her out." Sonara rose to her feet. Her wrist was warm where he had held it, and something beneath her ribs stirred for the first time since the rejection. Something small and quiet that she did not want to examine. She walked out without a word. The door closed behind her. She made it to the end of the corridor before her knees gave out. Hadric found her sitting on the stone floor with her back against the wall, her hands shaking in her lap. "You calmed him," the beta said. There was awe in his voice, and something heavier underneath it. "In 30 seconds you did what 4 healers and enough sedative to drop a horse could not." Sonara looked up at him. "He doesn't want me here. His wolf does. They are the same person." "No," Hadric said, and there was a weight behind the word that silenced her. "Right now they are not. And if his wolf cannot reach you, it will destroy him trying." The corridor was silent. Sonara closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the cold stone. "What are you asking me to do?" she whispered. "Stay," Hadric said. "Just stay." Sonara did not sleep that night. She sat in her guest room and listened to the palace breathe around her, to the distant footsteps of guards changing shifts, to the wind pressing against the windows, and beneath it all, so faint she might have imagined it, to the low vibration of a growl that seemed to pulse through the stone walls like a second heartbeat. In the morning, Hadric appeared with a woman Sonara recognized from the council chamber. The sharp-featured healer, older, with steel-gray hair cut short and hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades fixing what others had broken. "Adarin Voss," the woman said, extending her hand. "Chief healer of Thornhall. You are remarkably calm for someone who just walked into a room with a half-feral alpha and lived." Sonara shook her hand. "I didn't feel calm." "Good. Calm would have been concerning." Adarin's gaze swept over her, clinical and thorough. "How did you sleep?" "I didn't." "Any pain? Chest tightness? Difficulty breathing? Sensation of loss?" "No," Sonara said, and watched the healer's expression sharpen. "Interesting," Adarin murmured, "because the king experienced all of those throughout the night. His wolf calmed when you were in the room, but within an hour of your departure, the symptoms returned, worse than before." Sonara's stomach tightened. "You're saying I made it worse by leaving?" "I'm saying the bond is behaving in a way I have never encountered in 40 years of practice." Adarin crossed her arms. "In a normal rejection, the severed bond dissolves within days. The pain fades. Both parties heal. But this bond did not sever. It inverted. The king carries the full weight of rejection agony while you, the party who should be suffering, feel nothing at all." Sonara flinched slightly at the word nothing, though she was not sure why. "Has this happened before?" she asked. "Once," Adarin said. "In the old records. Over 300 years ago. An alpha of the Corvain line rejected his fated mate, and within a week his wolf had torn his body apart from the inside." She paused. "He did not survive." The room felt suddenly airless. "But it says in the same record that proximity to the rejected mate slowed the progression," Adarin continued. "Physical closeness. It didn't cure it, but it held the wolf at bay." "So you want me to sit beside a man who threw me out of his room and told his beta to remove me?" Sonara said flatly. "I want to try something." Hadric said from the doorway. A controlled experiment. You sit in his chambers while he works. No interaction. No conversation. You read a book, tend to your herbs, whatever you like. We observe whether your presence stabilizes him over a sustained period. Sonara looked between them. And the king agreed to this? The silence told her everything. He doesn't know, she said. He will be informed, Hadric said carefully. Before or after I'm sitting in his room. The beta had the grace to look uncomfortable. After. Sonara let out a slow breath through her nose. Wonderful. They brought her to his chambers an hour later after the healers had confirmed that Thalric was lucid and working at his desk. Hadric positioned her in a chair against the far wall, handed her a basket of dried herbs that someone had retrieved from her traveling kit, and left. The room had been put back together since the night before, mostly. A new chair replaced the one that had been splintered against the wall. The claw marks on the floor had been partially covered by a rug, but the air still carried the faint metallic edge of distress, and the king sat behind his desk with his back to her, rigid as carved stone. He knew she was there. She could tell by the way his pen had stopped moving the moment the door opened, by the way his shoulders had drawn up toward his ears, by the way his breathing had gone deliberately, forcefully even. Sonara sat in her chair, opened the basket, and began sorting dried yarrow from chamomile. She said nothing. 5 minutes passed. The pen resumed its scratching. 10 minutes. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. 20 minutes. And his breathing had shifted from controlled to genuinely relaxed, without him seeming to notice. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His handwriting was precise and angular. He read reports with the focus of a man who treated every document like a potential threat. But as the minutes stretched on, she saw his hand slow, saw his head tip forward slightly, saw the tight cords of his neck begin to loosen. By the time an hour had passed, the metallic scent in the air had faded completely. In its place was something warmer, cedar and wood smoke and something underneath that she could not name, something that made her wolf stir in a way it never had before. Sonara's hand stilled over the herbs. Thalric turned his head. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment neither of them moved. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were gray again, fully gray, no silver at the edges, no wolf pressing to get out. He looked more rested than he had any right to after the night he had endured. Then his gaze dropped to the sorting basket in her lap, and something flickered across his face. Not gratitude, not warmth. Something rawer than both. "You're the healer's apprentice," he said, "from Ashenmere." "Yes," Sonara replied, "and you are here because my beta put you here without my knowledge or consent." "Yes," she said again. "And if I told you to leave?" Sonara met his gaze steadily. "Then I would leave. And based on what your healers have told me, your wolf would begin tearing you apart again within the hour." Thalric's expression hardened. "I don't need a nursemaid." "No," Sonara agreed. "You need a mate. But you rejected that option yesterday, so a nursemaid is what's left." The quiet stretched between them. His eyes narrowed. She held her ground, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it, but her face betraying nothing. "You smiled," he said suddenly. Sonara blinked. "I'm sorry?" "At the ceremony, when I rejected you." His voice had dropped, rougher now, carrying something that sounded almost like accusation. "You smiled." "I did. Why?" Sonara considered the question. She could give him the easy answer, the polished, harmless version that would smooth this moment over and keep the distance between them clean and safe. "Because I was relieved," she said instead. "The truth, or at least part of it. I didn't choose to come here. My pack chose for me. I had 3 days to pack a life I never intended to leave and ride to a palace I had never seen to stand before a man I had never met, and hope he would claim me like livestock at auction. She paused. When you said no, it meant I could go home. Something shifted in his expression. She could not tell if it was surprise or something else. You didn't want the bond, he said. I didn't want to be chosen out of obligation. I didn't want to be a political gesture from a pack too small to refuse the crown. She held his gaze. There is a difference. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. Outside the window, a bird called once and went silent. And now? He asked. Now I am sitting in your chambers sorting herbs while your wolf decides whether it wants to destroy you, Sonara said. So it seems neither of us got what we wanted. Thalric stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his desk. Stay then, he said, and the words came out rough and reluctant and barely louder than a breath. For now. Sonara picked up a sprig of dried lavender and rolled it between her fingers, keeping her expression neutral even as her pulse roared in her ears. She did not smile this time, but she wanted to. The arrangement, as Hadric formally called it, was simple. Sonara would spend the daylight hours in the king's chambers. She would occupy herself quietly. She would not engage with the king unless addressed. She would leave each evening and return each morning, and the healers would monitor Thalric's condition throughout. And how long is this arrangement supposed to last? Sonara asked. Until we find a permanent solution, Hadric said. That is not an answer. No, Hadric agreed. It isn't. On the first day, Thalric ignored her so thoroughly she might have been a piece of furniture. He read, he wrote, he received advisors and dismissed them. He ate lunch at his desk without offering her so much as a glass of water, which she found more amusing than offensive. On the second day, he glanced at her twice. The first time when she sneezed. The second time when she dropped a jar of dried rosemary and muttered a word that was not appropriate for polite company. She caught the glance and the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth before he looked away. On the third day, he spoke first. What are you making? He asked without looking up from his correspondence. Sonara glanced down at the poultice she was preparing. A compress for joint inflammation. Hadric mentioned that Councillor Aldrin's shoulder has been troubling him. Aldrin complains about everything, Thalric said. That doesn't mean his shoulder isn't inflamed. A pause. Then, very quietly, almost grudgingly, his right shoulder. It locks if he sleeps on it wrong. Sonara looked at him. He was still writing, still not looking at her, but the fact that he had offered a detail, unprompted, about a member of his own council felt like a crack in a wall she had assumed was solid stone. Thank you, she said. I'll adjust the compress. He didn't respond, but his pen moved a little slower across the page, as though some small part of his attention had snagged on her and hadn't quite pulled free. A rhythm began to form. Mornings were quiet. Sonara arrived with her herbs and her work, settled into the chair that was now permanently positioned against the far wall, and let the hours pass. Thalric worked at his desk, received visitors, gave orders in a low voice that carried an authority so natural it seemed woven into his bones. She learned things about him in these hours, not because he shared them, but because she was a healer, and healers observed. She noticed that he rolled his left shoulder when he was tense, a repetitive motion that suggested an old injury that had never fully healed. She noticed that he drank his tea only when it had gone cold, which meant he forgot about it every single time. She noticed that he frowned when he read reports from the northern border, and that the frown deepened into something closer to grief when specific names appeared in the casualty lists. She noticed, with a pang she did not expect, that he was lonely. Not in the way of a man who wanted company, in the way of a man who had forgotten he was allowed to have it. On the fourth day, she brought a second cup. She set it on the edge of his desk without a word, filled with the same bitter black tea the kitchen sent up each morning. She returned to her chair and resumed her work. Thalric stared at the cup for a long time. Then he picked it up and drank. He didn't say, "Thank you." But the next morning, there were 2 cups already waiting on the tray when she arrived. On the 5th day, one of his advisors, a thin, nervous man named Brennick, entered the chamber and froze when he saw Sonara. "Sire, is this appropriate?" Brennick managed. "She's a healer performing a medical function," Thalric said without looking up. "Sit down." Brennick sat. He shot Sonara furtive glances throughout the meeting. After he left, Thalric exhaled through his nose. "He'll have told the entire East Wing by dinner," he said. "That the king has a healer in his office?" Sonara asked innocently. "That the king has the woman he publicly rejected sitting 5 paces from his desk every day." His voice was dry, but underneath it, she heard something tighter. "The court will draw its own conclusions." "Let them," Sonara said, and meant it. Thalric turned his head and looked at her fully, directly, for the first time in days. His gaze held hers, and she felt the weight of his attention settle over her like a heavy cloak. "You genuinely don't care," he said. It was not a question. "About gossip?" "No." "About any of it?" His brow furrowed. "The rejection, the rumors, being confined to this palace against your will. You sit there and sort your herbs and occasionally insult me, and none of it seems to touch you." Sonara's hands stilled. He was watching her with something she had not seen in his face before. Not anger, not frustration, fascination. The kind of fascination a man feels when he encounters something he cannot classify, cannot predict, and cannot control. "It touches me," she said quietly. "I am simply very practiced at not letting it show." Something shifted in his expression. The fascination didn't leave, but it deepened, folded into something gentler, and for a moment, the Alpha King looked almost vulnerable. "I know what that's like," he said. It was the closest thing to honesty she had heard from him, and it landed in her chest with a warmth that frightened her because she did not want to feel warm toward a man who had stood on a dais and thrown her away in front of the entire court. She did not want to notice that his hands were shaking slightly, or that the shadows beneath his eyes had deepened since the morning, or that even now, even with her sitting 5 paces away, the bond was not giving him peace. It was only giving him enough relief to function, just enough to keep his wolf from devouring him, but not enough to heal. That evening, when she returned to her guest room, Adarin was waiting for her. "Sit," the healer said. Sonara sat. Adarin pulled a chair opposite her and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, and the expression of a woman who had decided to stop being diplomatic. "The king's condition has stabilized while you are present," she said. "But the moment you leave his chambers each evening, the decline resumes, slower than before, but steady." "I know," Sonara said. "I can see it. He gets worse through the night, and each morning when I arrive, he looks a little more hollowed out than the day before." "Because daytime proximity is not enough." Adarin's eyes held hers. "The bond inversion is progressive. Your presence slows it, but it does not stop it. Based on the readings I've taken this week and on what happened to the Corvain Alpha 3 centuries ago, I believe the deterioration will continue to accelerate unless you are near him continuously." Sonara felt the blood drain from her face, continuously. "Through the night as well," Adarin confirmed. "His wolf is most vulnerable when he sleeps. That's when the inversion does its worst damage, when his conscious mind isn't there to fight it." "You're asking me to sleep in his chambers?" "I am telling you what the medicine requires." Adarin paused. "The choice, obviously, is yours." Sonara pressed her fingertips against her eyelids and tried to think past the roaring in her ears. She thought of the way his hand had trembled when he reached for his pen this afternoon. She thought of the bruised shadows under his eyes. She thought of the wolf in her dream, struggling alone in the dark. And she thought of the way he had looked at her and said, "I know what that's like," and how for one terrible, tender moment she had seen her own loneliness reflected back at her from the most powerful man in the realm. "He will refuse," Sonara said. "He will," Adarin agreed. "Which is why you are going to need to be the stubborn one. I have been told stubbornness is one of my more reliable qualities." "Good," Adarin said, "because I need to tell you one more thing, and you are not going to like it." Sonara's stomach dropped. Adarin's face was grave. "The Corvain case. The records say the damage became physical. His body began to fail. His heart gave out within 6 weeks of the rejection." Sonara could not breathe. "We are currently on day 5, Adarin said. Thalric refused the nighttime arrangement for exactly 14 hours. Sonara knew this because Hadric kept her informed with updates so dry they could have been used as kindling. "The king says he would rather be torn apart by his own wolf than share his chambers with a woman who was forced on him," Hadric reported at midday. "Charming," Sonara said. "The king threw a candlestick at the wall when I suggested it a second time," Hadric reported at dinner. "Was anyone hurt?" "Only the candlestick." "The king has agreed," Hadric reported at 10:30 that evening. He looked exhausted. "Though he used several words I will not repeat." Sonara packed a small bag, a change of clothes, her herb pouch, a book she had borrowed from the palace library about the history of bonded pairs, which she was reading less for information and more because it was so poorly written it made her feel better about her own situation. The walk to his chambers felt longer in the dark. Her footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and the guards they passed looked at her with expressions that fell somewhere between pity and alarm. Thalric was sitting on the edge of his bed when she entered, fully dressed, arms crossed, jaw set, radiating the specific kind of hostility that only came from a man who had lost an argument he should never have started. "There are conditions," he said before she could speak. "Of course," Sonara replied. "You sleep on that side." He jerked his chin toward the far edge of the bed where a narrow pallet had been set up. It looked borrowed from a servant's closet and about as comfortable as sleeping on a fence post. "You don't speak to me. You don't touch me. You don't look at me." "Should I also stop breathing?" Sonara asked. His jaw tightened. "If you could manage it." Sonara set her bag down beside the pallet and began unpinning her hair. She changed behind the dressing screen, put on her sleeping shift, and settled onto the pallet. It was exactly as uncomfortable as it looked. "Good night," she said. Silence. "Right," she murmured and closed her eyes. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, the kind of measured rhythm a person adopts when they are trying very hard to force their body towards sleep. It was not working. She could hear the tension in each exhale, the restless shift of weight as he adjusted his position on the mattress. 20 minutes passed. 30. His breathing grew more ragged. "You cannot sleep," Sonara said into the darkness. "I told you not to speak to me. And your wolf is getting agitated. I can feel it from here." A harsh exhale. "You can feel it?" Sonara paused. She had not meant to say that, but it was true. Since the day she had knelt before him and his wolf had gripped her wrist, she had become aware of a low, constant hum beneath her ribs. Not painful, not quite pleasant, just present, like a second pulse, and tonight it was quickening. "Faintly," she said, like a vibration. Neither of them spoke. The dark held everything they weren't saying. "When I was small," Sonara began, "Matron Ilara used to tell me stories at night because I couldn't sleep. She said the trick was to give the mind something gentle to follow so the body could let go." "I don't need bedtime stories," Thalric said flatly. "You need something." She kept her voice soft. "Because whatever you're doing right now is not working." Another silence. Then a sound she did not expect. A sigh. Not angry. Not frustrated. Defeated. "Fine," he said. Sonara stared at the ceiling and told him about Ashenmere, about the way the river turned silver in the autumn when the cottonwood seeds filled the air, about the old wolf, Farron, who tended the village smokehouse and sang off-key to the fish because he swore it improved the flavor. About the time the healer's apprentice, which was to say Sonara herself, accidentally prescribed a tonic that turned a man's tongue bright blue for a week, and how the man had been so delighted by the novelty that he refused the antidote. She talked until her voice grew soft and drowsy, and at some point during the story about Farron's singing, Thalric's breathing changed. It deepened, slowed. The tension drained out of the room like water through sand, and the vibration in her chest settled into something warm and steady. He was asleep. She lay still, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing, and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Not the warmth of obligation, not the satisfaction of duty performed. Something softer and more terrifying than either. She closed her eyes and tried very hard not to name it. 3 nights passed in this fashion. Sonara talked. Thalric pretended not to listen. Then he slept. Each night the sleep came faster, lasted longer, and the hollows beneath his eyes began slowly to fill in. On the 4th night she woke in the dark to the sound of him thrashing. Low guttural sounds tore from his throat. His body was rigid, his hands fisted in the sheets, and the pulse inside her chest had become a scream. She was on her feet before she thought about it, crossing the dark room toward his bed, reaching for his shoulder on instinct. "Thalric," she said, and her hand made contact with his skin. The world vanished. She was somewhere else. Somewhere vast and dark and wrong. The ground beneath her feet was soft, yielding, like standing on flesh rather than earth. The air tasted of iron and grief. There was no sky, only a low, pressing darkness that seemed to breathe. And in the center of this terrible place, she saw the wolf. It was enormous, the black wolf from her dream. But now she could see what the dream had only hinted at. Chains of light wrapped around its body, pressing into its fur, burning where they touched. The wolf strained against them, and each movement drew the chains tighter. A dark stain spread from where the light met fur, as though the wolf were being slowly drained. "Oh, gods," Sonara whispered. The wolf's head turned toward her. Its silver eyes locked onto hers, and what she saw in them was not rage. It was recognition. The wolf knew her. She moved toward it without thinking, her bare feet silent on the terrible ground, and as she drew closer, she felt something pour through the bond. Not pain, memory. She saw the great hall through eyes that were not hers. Saw herself walking toward the dais in her borrowed dress. Felt the jolt of recognition that had slammed through the wolf the moment it caught her scent. Mate. The word had rung through it like a bell, absolute and undeniable and joyous. And then, Thalric's voice, speaking the rejection. The wolf had screamed. Not outward, inward. It had thrown itself against its own consciousness, howling, clawing, trying to stop what was happening. And when the bond began to sever, when the agony meant for Sonara began to descend, the wolf did something impossible. It stepped in front of the pain. It took the fire meant for her and swallowed it whole. Every searing wave, every howl of loss, every shred of the rejection agony that should have torn Sonara apart, the wolf absorbed it into itself. Not because it was forced to, because it chose to. Because its mate should never have to feel that. Sonara dropped to her knees beside the wolf, tears streaming down her face. The chains of light were the bond itself, inverted and twisted, burning the wolf from the inside. Each chain was an echo of the rejected connection, a thread of what should have been warmth and safety turned into a weapon. "You did this for me," she choked out. "You're dying for me." The wolf pressed its muzzle against her palm. Its breathing was labored, shallow, and beneath the magnificent black fur, she could feel its ribs far too clearly. It was starving. The inverted bond was consuming it from within. Sonara woke gasping, wrenching upright in the darkness of the king's chambers. Her cheeks were wet. Her hand was pressed flat against Thalric's chest, and beneath her palm, his heartbeat was wild and irregular. He was still asleep, but his face was twisted in pain, and the bond in her chest had gone jagged and sharp. She pulled her hand back slowly, carefully, and sat on the edge of his bed, trembling. The wolf was dying faster than anyone knew. The chains she had seen, the way it struggled to breathe, the ribs beneath the fur. Adarin's 6-week estimate was wrong. They didn't have 6 weeks. She wasn't sure they had 2. Sonara did not sleep for the rest of that night. At first light, she went to find Adarin. The healer took one look at her face and set down the mortar she was grinding. Sonara told her everything. The vision, the chains of light, the wolf's choice to absorb the rejection pain, the failing heartbeat, the visible ribs. Adarin listened without interrupting. You entered his wolf's inner landscape, she said finally. The deepest layer of an alpha's consciousness. Almost no one can access it. Healers have tried for centuries. How did I get in? Because of what you are to him. Fated bonds create a bridge between wolves. When Thalric rejected you, the bridge should have collapsed. Instead, his wolf held it open from his side, at the cost of everything it had. Sonara's chest ached. How do we save it? Adarin met her eyes. The bond needs to be completed, accepted by both parties freely and fully. That is the only thing that will reverse the inversion and release the wolf. He won't do it, Sonara said. He can barely tolerate me being in his room. He tolerates you better than he tolerates anyone, Adarin said. Don't confuse his resistance for indifference. Sonara shook her head. Even if he agreed, a public rejection can only be reversed by the renewal rite. Both parties choosing each other before the full court. He would have to stand in that same hall before every witness who watched him reject me and admit he was wrong. Yes, Adarin said simply. The impossibility of it settled over Sonara like a weight. She returned to his chambers that morning and tried to act normal. She sat in her chair. She sorted her herbs. She did not mention the vision, or the wolf, or the chains of light she could still feel burning behind her eyelids when she closed her eyes. But something had shifted. The vibration in her chest was louder now, insistent, as though something inside her had woken up and was pressing against her skin, trying to get closer to him, her wolf. For the first time in her life, Sonara's wolf was fully awake. Not the drowsy, half-present creature that had stirred occasionally throughout her life, but a living, restless, desperate awareness that oriented toward Thalric like a compass needle finding north. She dropped a bottle of tincture. Her hands were shaking. She caught Thalric watching her from his desk and looked away quickly. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question startled her. Not because it was unusual, but because his voice carried something it had not carried before. Concern. Real, unguarded concern. "Fine," she lied. "Clumsy morning." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and she saw the question forming behind his eyes. But he didn't ask it. He turned back to his work, and Sonara clenched her trembling hands in her lap and tried to breathe. The symptoms came gradually. A headache behind her left eye that refused to leave. A tightness in her chest that worsened whenever she stepped away, even briefly. A creeping wrongness that settled into her bones like cold. She hid it. She had been hiding things her entire life. But Thalric noticed. His instincts, even damaged, were sharper than anyone's. "You're pale," he said on the second evening, watching her set up her herbs. "I'm always pale." "Paler than usual." He stood from his desk and crossed the room toward her. "And you haven't eaten since this morning. I asked the kitchen. You asked the kitchen about my meals? Sonara looked up at him, surprised. A flush crept up his neck. Adarin asked me to monitor your health. Adarin asked you, she repeated. Yes. And you always do what Adarin tells you? His jaw worked. When it concerns someone under my protection. The words hung between them. Under my protection. She watched something flicker across his face, an awareness that he had said more than he intended, followed by the rapid construction of a wall behind his eyes. I am fine, Sonara said firmly. Thank you for your concern. She was not fine. The headache worsened through the night. She lay on her pallet and listened to him fall asleep, to the low hum of the bond vibrating through her bones, and felt the wrongness spreading through her body like ink through water. By the following morning, she could not hide it. She stumbled rising from the pallet, caught herself on the bedpost, and for one terrible moment the room spun so violently she was certain she was going to collapse. Thalric was beside her before she registered him moving. His hand closed around her arm, steadying her, and the contact sent a jolt of relief through her body so intense she gasped. What is happening to you? He demanded. His face was close. His eyes were searching hers with an urgency that bordered on panic. The bond, Sonara managed. The room was still tilting. I think the bond is starting to affect me now. His expression shifted from panic to horror. He released her arm like her skin had scalded him and stepped back. No, he said. No. This is what I was afraid of. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Thalric, it isn't. I am poisoning you. His voice cracked on the word. The inversion. It is spreading. Whatever is killing my wolf is reaching you through the bridge. That is not what's happening. How do you know it isn't me? He was pacing, his hands in his hair. Everything I touch falls apart. Everyone I try to protect ends up paying for it. The words came out raw and ragged. This was not just about her. Thalric, please listen to me. You need to leave. He stopped pacing. His eyes were silver at the edges. Leave this palace. Go back to Ashenmere. Get as far from me as you can. If I leave, your wolf dies, Sonara said. Then it dies. His voice broke. Better that than watching it take you down with me. Sonara stared at him. The hum in her chest was screaming now, her wolf throwing itself toward him with everything it had, and the pain of resisting it was blinding. You don't get to make that choice for me, she said. I am your king. You are the man who rejected me before the entire court, and is now telling me to leave because he is afraid of caring about the consequences. Her voice was shaking, but she did not stop. You don't get to reject me and then claim you are protecting me. Those are not the same thing. Thalric flinched like she had struck him. Go, he said, and the word came out as barely a whisper. Please. There was no anger in it, only grief. Only the desperate, drowning plea of someone watching himself destroy the one thing his wolf had chosen to die for. Sonara left. She made it to the infirmary before the pain hit. Not gradually, not gently. It slammed into her chest like a fist, doubling her over, stealing the air from her lungs. She grabbed the edge of Adarin's workbench and held on as her vision went white. Sonara! Adarin caught her before she fell. The pain was everywhere. In her ribs, in her throat, behind her eyes. Her wolf was howling inside her, a sound so raw and anguished it didn't feel like it belonged to her at all. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't do anything except cling to Adarin's arms and try not to scream. The bond, Adarin said, lowering her to the floor. It's fully active now. Both sides. He sent me away, Sonara gasped. Of course he did. Because he is a fool who would rather die than admit he needs someone. Adarin's voice was tight. The pain eased into a deep, persistent ache. Sonara lay on the cold stone floor and stared at the ceiling. Do you want to know why he really rejected you? Adarin asked. Sonara turned her head. It wasn't the council, though they pressured him. It wasn't politics, though those played a role. Adarin's face was compassionate and unyielding in equal measure. I have known that man since he was a boy with skinned knees and nightmares about the dark. He rejected you because he felt the bond the instant you walked into that hall, and it terrified him. Sonara's breath caught. He felt you, Adarin continued. Every part of you. Your calm, your strength, your kindness. And he looked at you standing there in that ill-fitting dress, looking entirely at peace, and he thought you didn't want him. I was at peace because I expected the rejection, Sonara whispered. And he rejected you because he saw your peace and mistook it for indifference. Adarin shook her head. Two people so afraid of being unwanted that they guaranteed the very outcome they feared. Tears spilled down Sonara's face. Now, Adarin said, her voice gentler now, I need to tell you something difficult. And then you need to make a decision. Sonara wiped her eyes. Tell me. The bond is fully active. Your wolf has awakened, and the inversion is damaging both of you now. If the bond is not completed within the next several days, both wolves will fail. His first, then yours. The ceiling blurred. You can still leave, Adarin said quietly. If you go now, there is a small chance your wolf survives the separation. You would suffer. You would be diminished. But you might live. And him? Sonara asked. Adarin's silence was answer enough. Or you can stay. Fight for this. But if you stay, there is no going back. You will be bound to a man who is terrified of his own need for you and will fight you every step of the way because he believes he is saving you by pushing you away. Sonara closed her eyes. She thought of Ashenmere, of the river that turned silver in autumn, of matron Alara's stories and Farron's singing and the quiet, safe, invisible life she had built in a place where no one expected anything of her because no one had ever wanted her enough to ask. She thought of the way Thalric had caught her when she stumbled, the way his hand had closed around her arm, steady and sure and warm. The way he had asked the kitchen about her meals and then blushed when she caught him. She thought of his wolf, chained and starving and burning, choosing to fade rather than let her feel an instant of pain. And she thought of herself, of every time she had been sent away, of every time she had smiled and said thank you, and turned and walked and never looked back, because looking back meant admitting that leaving hurt. She opened her eyes. I am done being the one who leaves, she said. Sonara found Hadric outside the council chamber. I need to get back into his rooms, she said. Hadric studied her face. Whatever he saw there must have been convincing, because he didn't argue. He gave orders. No one is to admit you. Then I need you to countermand those orders. You're asking the king's beta to disobey the king. I am asking the king's beta to save the king's life. Sonara held his gaze. His wolf has days, not weeks. Mine is failing too. If I do not get back in that room and make him listen to me, you will lose your king, and I will lose everything. Hadric was silent for a long beat. He will be furious, he said. He can be furious and alive. I prefer that to the alternative. A guard escorted her through the corridors that evening. The palace was quiet, the torches guttering in their brackets, throwing long shadows across the stone walls. Sonara's chest ached with every step, her wolf pressing forward so urgently it felt like something trying to claw its way out of her body. The guard opened the door to Thalric's chambers without a word and left. Thalric was standing by the window, silhouetted against the last gray light of dusk. He turned when he heard her enter, and the look on his face was a devastation she had not prepared for. Relief, agony, fury, hope. All of them at once, crashing across his features like waves breaking against stone. I told you to leave, he said, His voice was raw. You did. I gave an order. You gave a plea dressed up as authority. Sonara stepped further into the room, and I am choosing not to comply. He moved toward her, and she could see what the day apart had done to him. The dark circles beneath his eyes had deepened. His hands were trembling. The silver was bleeding into his irises, his wolf pressing forward with a desperation that made her chest constrict. You are going to get yourself killed, he said. So are you. She stopped in the center of the room, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body. Your wolf is dying, Thalric. I have seen it. I touched you during a nightmare, and your wolf pulled me into its inner landscape, and I saw the chains burning through it. I saw the ribs beneath its fur. I felt it choosing to die rather than let me suffer. His face went white. You saw it? Your wolf took the rejection pain that was meant for me. It absorbed every shred of it. It is being consumed by a bond it refused to let go of, even after you threw it away. Thalric's breathing had gone ragged. You should not have been able to see that. But I did. Sonara's voice cracked. And now I need you to tell me the truth, not the version you tell your counsel, not the version you tell yourself at night when you're trying to justify what you did. The truth. He stared at her, and the mask he wore, the iron composure, the untouchable authority, began to fracture. Why did you reject me? She asked. The silence was unbearable. Because I am not what you think I am, he said. That is not an answer. Because I am a king who sends men to die and sleeps in a palace while their families grieve. Because my wolf carries the weight of a war I started. Because you walked into that hall smelling like lavender and river water, and you looked at me like I was just a man. And I. He stopped. His voice fractured. I felt you. The bond. I felt it the moment you stepped through those doors, and it was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Sonara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. You were calm, he continued, the words pouring out now like something that had been damned for weeks. You stood there looking at me with those steady eyes, and I thought, she doesn't feel it. She doesn't want this. She doesn't want me. And I could not stand the thought of binding myself to someone who would spend the rest of her life wishing she were somewhere else. So you rejected me first, Sonara whispered, before I could reject you. He closed his eyes. Yes. The word hung between them, small and devastating. I was calm because I was terrified, Sonara said. Her own tears were falling now. I was calm because every time I have ever been sent somewhere new, handed off, given away, I learned that the only thing I could control was my face. I smiled because it was all I had, not because I didn't feel the bond. She swallowed hard. I felt it, Thalric. I felt it and I buried it because I didn't think I was allowed to want something that enormous. He opened his eyes. The silver and the gray warred in his irises. You felt it, he repeated, from the first moment. His hand reached for her face, then stopped, hovering an inch from her cheek. She could feel the tremor in his fingers. If I touch you, he said, I don't think I can stop. Then don't stop. His hand closed the distance, his palm pressed against her cheek, warm and calloused and shaking, and the bond roared to life between them. Not the twisted, inverted agony of the past weeks. Something brighter. Something that burned through her veins like sunrise and settled in her chest like coming home. His forehead dropped to hers. His breathing was ragged, his eyes closed, and she could feel his wolf surging forward, reaching for her through the bond with a desperate, starving need. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry I sent you away. I'm sorry I was too afraid to choose you. Then choose me now, Sonara said. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of someone who had been drowning for weeks and had finally broken the surface. His hands cradled her face, tilting her toward him, and she gripped the front of his shirt and pulled him closer. The bond sang between them, bright and fierce and aching with everything they had denied. When they broke apart gasping, his eyes were gray again. Fully gray. The silver was gone. "The renewal rite," Sonara said, breathless. "Adarin says the bond needs to be formally accepted. Both of us. Before the court." A muscle worked in his cheek. "You want me to stand before the same people who watched me reject you and tell them I was wrong?" "Yes." In front of the entire court. In front of everyone. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, burning through it, was something stronger. "And if I do this," he said, "you will stay?" Sonara took his hand and pressed it flat against her chest, over her heart, where the bond hummed like a living thing. "I already chose to stay," she said. "Now it's your turn." Thalric didn't answer. His hand stayed pressed against her heart. His thumb moved slowly across her collarbone, and the tenderness in the gesture made her throat close. "Tomorrow," he said. "The rite takes place tomorrow." But in the space between his words, his face changed. A spasm of pain crossed his features, sharp and sudden, and his hand dropped from her chest. He stumbled back a step, his hand going to his ribs. "Thalric?" "The wolf," he gasped. He doubled forward, one hand braced on his desk. "Something is wrong. Something is—" His knees buckled. Sonara caught him before he hit the floor, wrapping her arms around him, pulling his weight against her. She could feel the bond convulsing between them, the bright warmth of moments ago twisting into something jagged and wrong. Through the bond, she felt the wolf, felt the chains tightening, felt the last reserves of its strength crumbling, felt it reaching for her with everything it had left. "We don't have until tomorrow," Sonara whispered, her arms tightening around him. "Thalric, the wolf is failing. We need to go to it. We need to go now." His hand found hers and gripped it like a lifeline. "Together," he said. Sonara closed her eyes, pressed her forehead against his, and let the bond pull them both under. The inner landscape was dying. Sonara opened her eyes to a world that had decayed since her last visit. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and gray, splitting apart like dried riverbed. The breathing darkness overhead had thinned to something brittle and translucent, and through the cracks, she could see nothing. Not sky, not light, just the absence of everything. Thalric was beside her, solid and real, his hand still gripping hers. His breath came in sharp, shallow pulls, and his eyes swept the ruined landscape with the expression of a man seeing something he had suspected, but refused to believe. "This is what it looks like inside me," he said. Not a question. "This is what the inversion has done," Sonara corrected gently. "This is not you." But he was not listening. He was staring at the wolf. It lay in the center of the crumbling ground, curled in on itself, its massive body drawn tight against the chains of light that still wrapped around its ribs, its throat, its legs. The chains had sunk deeper since Sonara's last visit, buried now beneath the fur, glowing faintly from within like embers dying in ash. The wolf's breathing was barely visible, a shallow flutter in its flank that stuttered and caught with each inhale. Thalric dropped to his knees beside it. His hand hovered over the wolf's side, trembling, not quite touching. "What have I done to you?" he whispered. The wolf's silver eye opened. It looked at Thalric, and the love in that gaze was so raw and so absolute that Sonara had to look away. "The chains," she said, kneeling beside him. "They are not a curse. They are not something done to you from the outside. They are yours, Thalric." He looked at her, not understanding. "Watch," she said, and reached for the nearest chain. The moment her fingers made contact, it spoke. Not in sound, in feeling. A wave of conviction so deep it felt like bedrock, pouring through her fingertips and into her chest. I destroy everything I touch. Sonara flinched. She reached for the next chain. She will suffer because of me. Everyone does. The next. I do not deserve this. I never did. The next. A better man would have saved them. A better king would not need saving. She pulled her hand back, shaking. Each chain was a belief. Each link was a thought he had repeated so many times it had calcified into something physical, something that wrapped around his wolf and squeezed tighter with every passing day. "These are yours," she said again, her voice thick with tears. "You made them. Every time you told yourself you weren't enough. Every time you looked at your own hands and saw only the damage they'd done. You wrapped your wolf in your own self-hatred and you called it protection." Thalric's face crumbled. "It is not self-hatred. It is the truth." "It is a lie," Sonara said fiercely. "It is the lie you've been telling yourself since the war, since before the war, since you were a boy who thought he had to earn the right to exist, and your wolf is dying because of it." "You don't know what I've done," he said. "The people I've failed. I know that you felt a bond with a stranger who smelled like lavender and river water, and your first instinct was to throw it away because you thought you didn't deserve it." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I know what that feels like. I have spent my entire life believing that I was the kind of person people leave, that if I was small enough, quiet enough, useful enough, maybe someone would let me stay. And when you rejected me, I smiled because I thought, Of course he doesn't want me. No one ever has." Thalric stared at her. "But I was wrong," Sonara continued. "I was wrong about myself, and you are wrong about yourself. I am not something people throw away, and you are not something that ruins everything it touches. Your wolf knew that the moment it saw me, it chose me. It chose to die for me, rather than let me feel the pain of your rejection." She was crying now, tears falling freely. "And you need to decide if you are going to let it." The landscape trembled. The cracks in the ground widened. Somewhere in the darkness above, something groaned like a structure on the verge of collapse. "The chains are yours," Sonara said. "Only you can take them off. But you have to believe you deserve to." Thalric looked at his wolf. The magnificent, broken, starving creature that had absorbed a mountain of agony for a woman it had known for 30 seconds. That had held the bridge open between them even as it burned. That had howled his mate's name through sedation and pain and despair because it refused, absolutely refused, to let her go. "I don't know how," he said, and the admission came out small and terrified and utterly honest. "Yes, you do." Sonara took his hand and placed it on the wolf's side, over its heart. "Choose me, not because you have to, not because you'll die if you don't. Choose me because you want to, because your wolf already did, and maybe it's time you trusted it." His hand pressed flat against the wolf's ribs. She felt the moment it happened. Not a sound, not a flash of light. Just a shift, deep and tectonic, like the ground settling after an earthquake. "I deserve this." The thought moved through him, quiet and fragile and new. "I deserve to be chosen. I deserve to choose." The first chain shattered, then the second, then the third. They broke apart like glass, dissolving into light that scattered across the crumbling ground and sank into the earth. One by one, belief by belief, the chains that Thalric had wrapped around his own wolf fell away. The wolf stirred. Its head lifted. Its breathing deepened, steadied, grew strong. Muscle filled back beneath the fur. The silver eyes blazed bright, and the massive creature rose to its feet with a sound that was half growl and half sob. It turned to Sonara, and from somewhere deep inside her, a place she had kept locked and silent her entire life, her own wolf answered. It surged forward with a force that stole her breath, pressing against the inside of her skin, reaching through the bond toward the black wolf with a joy so fierce it burned. The two wolves met in a collision of light and warmth that tore through the dying landscape like dawn breaking over a frozen world. The cracks sealed. The darkness retreated. The ground beneath them solidified, softened, turned from gray ash to dark earth to something living and warm. The bond completed, not with violence, not with ceremony, with the quiet, absolute certainty of two halves recognizing each other and refusing, finally, to be apart. Sonara opened her eyes. They were in his chambers. The fire had burned low. Dawn light crept through the window, pale gold. Thalric lay beside her, his hand still gripping hers, and when his eyes opened, they were clear. No silver at the edges, no wolf pressing to escape, just gray, calm and deep, and looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "It's gone," he said. "The pain, the pulling, it's gone." Sonara pressed her forehead against his and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for weeks. "Welcome back," she whispered. The renewal rite took place 3 days later. Thalric insisted on the full ceremony. Every counselor, every noble house, every witness who had watched him reject her in that same hall now stood in the same seats and watched him choose her. He wore the formal black of the Velrin line. She wore a dress that fit this time, deep green, chosen by a Darren who had opinions about color and was not shy about sharing them. 300 people held their breath as the Alpha King spoke. "I, Thalric Velrin, Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, claim the bond I once denied. I choose Sonara of Ashenmere as my mate, my equal, and my partner in all things. Not because duty compels me, not because survival demands it, because she walked into this hall and I knew, and I was too afraid to say it then. I am not afraid now." The hall was silent. Sonara stood before him, and for the first time in her life, her armor failed her. She tried to smile. She had spent 22 years perfecting that smile, the steady, composed, unbreakable mask she wore for every rejection, every departure, every moment when the world told her she was not enough. She couldn't do it. Instead, she cried, not delicately, not gracefully. She stood in front of 300 people and wept because someone had finally, publicly, irrevocably chosen her. Thalric reached for her hand. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said softly. Sonara laughed through her tears. It was worth the wait. The healing was not instant. There were nights when his wolf stirred and he reached for her in the dark, needing the reassurance of her warmth against his chest. There were mornings when she woke and felt the old instinct to make herself small, to earn her place through usefulness rather than simply existing. But each time, the bond hummed between them, reminding them both of what they had chosen. Months later, on a quiet evening, Sonara sat in the chair that was still positioned against the wall of his office, sorting dried lavender while he read a report. Neither of them was speaking, and the silence was the comfortable kind that only existed between two people who had stopped being afraid of it. Thalric looked up from his desk. "You're smiling," he said. Sonara glanced at him. She was, in fact, smiling. Not the practiced one, not the armor, just a smile, simple and unguarded and real. "I am," she said. "Why?" She looked at him, at the man who had rejected her and then torn his world apart to choose her, at the king whose wolf had loved her before he had the courage to. "Because I'm happy," she said. Thalric held her gaze. Then he smiled back, slow and warm and full of something that looked a lot like wonder. They returned to their work. The fire crackled. The evening light turned gold, and the bond between them hummed on, steady as a heartbeat, quiet as breath, permanent as stone.